The ground trembled beneath his feet as Jason dug through the dirt, the strange feeling of something lurking just out of reach pulsing through the air. It wasn't the kind of place a boy would usually wander into, but something had driven him here. A pull, an irresistible urge he couldn't ignore. He had found it, the map, worn and crumpled, hidden deep inside an old chest in his grandmother's attic. For days it had been burning a hole in his pocket, whispering secrets he didn't fully understand. The map was a mystery, yes, but it was more than that. It was the key to something bigger, something he was not ready for but couldn't turn away from. The shadows of the trees above seemed to reach toward him as if warning him to stop. But the thrill in his chest grew with each step he took. What would he find? What dangers awaited? Jason had never been particularly brave. In fact, he was the quiet, somewhat awkward boy who spent more time reading than playing. At 11, he felt older than his years, always lost in thoughts, never quite fitting in. The kids at school teased him for being different, for preferring old books to the noisy games they played. And while he had a few friends, they were rarely the kind who sought adventure. They were content with simple games, ones where the stakes weren't higher than the afternoon sun. But something inside Jason, something deep and instinctual, told him that the map was different. It was a promise of discovery, a promise of a world outside the one he had grown tired of. His curiosity, once a quiet whisper, had become a loud drumbeat, urging him to find out what lay beyond the trees and fields. He was finally going to prove that there was more to life than his small town, that he was capable of something larger than simply following the same old routine. The map had come from his grandmother, of course. His grandmother was not the type to share secrets often, and certainly not with a boy like him. Yet, when Jason had asked about the strange old chest he found in the attic, a chest filled with curiosities and oddments from years gone by, she had smiled. "You're the right age now," she had said. "Take it, but be careful." What she meant, he didn't know, but her eyes had twinkled with a knowing, as if she were remembering something she had long forgotten. And so Jason had carefully folded the map, put it into his pocket, and not long after found himself standing in the middle of a forest, miles from home. The air was thick with the smell of moss and damp earth. Every step he took felt like it echoed in the silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves as birds flitted between branches. The map, which he had studied meticulously in the hours before, had led him here to a clearing at the edge of the forest. It was strange, a place he had never seen before, yet it felt familiar, like the map itself had been drawn by someone who knew this land, knew this secret. Jason glanced down again at the paper, now folded and crinkled in his hand. The ink was faded, the markings nearly impossible to read in some places, but there were symbols he recognized, symbols that made his heart race. The underground city was real. A shiver ran down his spine, a city buried beneath the earth, lost to time, what had once been a thriving place, hidden away for reasons he couldn't comprehend. It made no sense. How could something so vast, so grand, remain hidden for so long? He glanced around, his heart pounding. The forest had a quiet, unnerving stillness to it, almost as if the trees themselves were watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the map again. The symbols were clear now, almost as if they had been waiting for him to understand their meaning, but there was a hesitation, a doubt that tugged at his insides. He could turn back. He could go home, forget all of this. But Jason's feet were already moving. There was a pull, an undeniable force urging him forward, one that had been building since the moment he had touched the map. The map had chosen him. He didn't know why, but it didn't matter. Something about the idea of discovering this hidden city, of unearthing its secrets, filled him with a sense of purpose he had never felt before. And so, with no more hesitation, Jason followed the path that the map seemed to outline. The trees parted as if giving way to him, guiding him towards something beyond his understanding. It was as though the world itself had been waiting for him to find this place. The excitement bubbled up inside him. He was not just a boy in a quiet town anymore. He was someone on the edge of a discovery, someone about to change everything. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing, Jason reached the spot the map had marked. His breath caught as he saw it, an ancient stone doorway, half covered in vines and moss, barely visible unless one knew exactly where to look. It was a doorway like no other, with strange carvings etched into the stone, some worn away by time, others still vivid and sharp. The air around it seemed to vibrate with energy, as if it was alive, waiting for something. Jason reached out a hand, trembling. The door seemed to beckon, promising answers, offering a glimpse into a world no one had seen in centuries. But the map had warned him. Beneath this city, he knew, danger awaited. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind, "Be careful." He took a deep breath, and then, with a steady hand, he pushed the stone door open. It groaned in protest, a sound that sent chills down his spine, but it opened wide, revealing a dark passage beyond. The air was thick with the scent of earth and something older, something that made his skin crawl. The passage was narrow, the walls lined with intricate carvings, as though telling stories from a forgotten time. Jason's heart raced. There was no turning back now. Whatever lay ahead would change him. Would he be able to survive? Would he make it out? His mind swirled with questions, but there was no time for answers. One step forward, and he was inside. The door creaked shut behind him with a heavy finality, and Jason felt the weight of what he had just done. But it was too late to turn back now. His journey into the unknown had begun. Jason stood motionless in the dimly lit corridor, his heart pounding in his chest as the heavy stone door shut behind him. The silence was suffocating, the only sound the faint drip of water echoing from somewhere far beyond the walls. The passage stretched before him, a winding labyrinth of stone and shadows leading deeper into the earth. A feeling of unease crept over him like a cold hand, gripping his chest and sending chills down his spine. He couldn't explain it, but something about this place made him feel watched. The map had been so certain, so confident in its directions, but now, standing in the heart of this forgotten city, Jason felt an overwhelming sense of doubt. What had he gotten himself into? He glanced at the walls, etched with strange symbols he couldn't decipher. His fingers traced the edges of one of the carvings, rough and ancient, as though it had been there long before even the oldest trees outside. His breath came in shallow bursts, his eyes scanning the dark passage ahead, the air thick with the musty scent of time and decay. For a moment, he considered turning back, but the pull was too strong. The map had led him here. He had to see it through. Suddenly, a noise echoed down the passage, sharp and loud, a rustle of movement followed by a faint scraping sound. Jason froze, his heart leaping into his throat. His mind raced, searching for an explanation. "Hello?" he whispered, his voice barely a breath. There was no response, only the unsettling silence that seemed to press in on him from all sides. For a long moment he stood there, straining to hear anything that might break the stillness. Then, without warning, the scraping sound returned, louder this time. It came from the far end of the passage, too far to see, but close enough to make his pulse race. Jason's instincts screamed at him to run, to turn around and leave this forsaken place. But something deep inside held him in place. What if it was someone else like him, drawn to the mysteries of this hidden city? His grandmother's warning echoed in his mind. Be careful. A low voice broke through the silence, a faint whisper that seemed to vibrate in the air. "Who's there?" Jason called out, his voice stronger now, though it wavered slightly. The whisper grew louder, more distinct. Jason took a cautious step forward, his footfall echoing through the passage. The air grew heavier, thick with a tension that made it hard to breathe. He could feel it now, a presence in the dark, lurking just beyond his sight. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the shadows ahead. Jason froze, his heart racing. The figure was tall, cloaked in darkness, its features obscured by the dim light. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he instinctively took a step back. The figure didn't move, only stared at him with a gaze that felt far too knowing. "Who are you?" Jason asked, his voice shaking despite himself. The figure remained silent, watching him. Jason swallowed hard, trying to calm his nerves, but his hands trembled. What was this? Who was this person? I'm Jason, he stammered, trying to sound braver than he felt. I came here to explore. The figure's eyes narrowed, as if evaluating him. For a moment there was no sound, no movement, only the eerie stillness of the underground city. Then finally the figure spoke. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was low, hoarse, almost a whisper. "This place is cursed." Jason's heart skipped a beat. A chill ran down his spine as he tried to make sense of the words. Cursed? Was that why the city had been hidden away for so long? He couldn't help but feel the weight of the stranger's words as if they were true, but Jason couldn't turn back now. He had come this far. I have to find out, Jason said, his voice growing more confident. "I found a map. It led me here." The figure took a step forward, its silhouette slowly becoming clearer in the dim light. "The map?" it asked, its voice dripping with a strange mix of amusement and warning. "That map has brought many before you, but none have returned." Jason's blood ran cold. None had returned? What did that mean? His thoughts raced, his mind spiraling with questions, but the stranger didn't give him a chance to ask. "You think you're the first?" The figure's voice was colder now, almost mocking. "This city was lost for a reason. It holds secrets, yes, but it also holds dangers. You should turn back before it's too late." Jason's stomach twisted. He was afraid. The kind of fear that wraps around you like a vice, squeezing tighter with each word. But he couldn't let that fear win. He had come this far. He had to know what lay ahead. "I'm not leaving," Jason said, his voice firmer now. "I have to see it." The figure let out a long, exasperated sigh. "Then you are a fool," it said, its voice growing fainter as it stepped back into the shadows. "But you are not the first fool to come, and you won't be the last." Jason's heart raced as the figure disappeared from view, leaving him alone once again in the dark. His breath came in shallow bursts as he forced himself to take a step forward. Every instinct told him to turn around, to run back to the safety of the outside world. But he couldn't. Not now. Not after everything he had come here to find. The passage seemed to stretch on forever, the walls narrowing as he walked, the air growing colder, denser with each step. The faint sound of water dripping echoed through the narrow corridor, each drop amplifying the silence, until Jason could hear nothing else. Then, without warning, the ground beneath his feet shifted. The stone floor cracked with a loud, thunderous sound, and Jason stumbled, his heart leaping into his throat. He barely managed to catch himself against the wall, his palms scraping against the rough surface. A faint rumble echoed through the corridor, followed by another loud crack. The ground trembled again, this time stronger, sending a wave of panic through Jason's chest. He didn't know what was happening. Was it an earthquake? Was the city collapsing? He had no idea. His heart raced as he forced himself to his feet, a wild, desperate energy surging through him. The rumbling grew louder, more insistent. It was as if the very earth was coming alive, threatening to swallow him whole. Jason turned and ran, his footsteps pounding against the stone, the fear driving him forward. But then, in the distance, through the thick darkness, he saw something moving. He stopped dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. It was another figure, a shadow, standing at the far end of the passage, watching him with an unsettling stillness. "Get out," a voice. But Jason didn't hear the rest. He was already running, his body propelled forward by fear, the walls closing in around him as the mysterious figure faded into the darkness behind him. He didn't know what would happen next, but the only thing he could be certain of was this. Whatever he had found, he hadn't come close to understanding its true danger yet. Jason ran down the corridor, his breath coming in ragged gasps, each step sending shockwaves of panic through his body. The rumble beneath his feet hadn't stopped. It was as though the city itself was alive, groaning under some unseen force, as if it was preparing to swallow him whole. The air was thick with dust, and the narrow passage seemed to grow tighter with every step, as if the walls were closing in on him. He turned a corner, nearly slipping on the slick stone floor, and skidded to a halt. The passage ahead had collapsed, rocks and rubble scattered across the floor, blocking any further escape. His heart thudded in his chest, the weight of dread settling over him like a heavy blanket. There was no way forward, no way out. His mind raced. What should he do? The map had led him here, to this place of mysteries and dangers. But now, with the city shaking beneath his feet and the sense of something closing in around him, Jason had no idea what he was supposed to do next. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready for the terror, the unknown. A sound broke through his thoughts, a low, guttural growl that made his blood run cold. Jason's body froze as his eyes darted around, searching for the source of the noise. It was coming from the shadows ahead, just beyond the debris. He strained his ears, the rumble of the collapsing city masked by the eerie growl. Someone was watching him. He took a step back, his hands shaking. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by a thud, as if something large was moving toward him. His heart raced, a wild pulse of fear. He had no choice but to keep moving, to keep running, even though every instinct told him to turn back. But where could he go? The way he had come was now blocked, and the path ahead led only deeper into darkness. Suddenly, a shadow darted across the passage, too fast for him to fully make out. Jason's breath hitched, and he pressed himself against the cold wall, trying to make himself as small as possible. The growl was louder now, closer, like a predator stalking its prey. Jason's mind screamed at him to run, but his legs felt frozen, as though they were rooted to the stone floor. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, moving with terrifying speed. Jason's eyes widened as the creature stepped into the faint light, its glowing eyes locked on him. It was large, too large, its hunched body covered in matted fur and its jaws dripping with saliva. The creature was a twisted, monstrous version of something Jason couldn't name, its claws scraping the stone floor as it crept toward him. Jason's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. What was this thing? What had he stumbled into? Was this one of the dangers the mysterious figure had warned him about? With a sudden surge of adrenaline, Jason turned and bolted down the passage, his footsteps echoing in the confined space. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to get away, to escape this nightmare. The growl of the creature grew louder, its pursuit relentless, every second bringing it closer. His feet pounded against the stone, his mind frantic. He turned another corner, his body slamming into the wall as he tried to steer himself away from the creature's reach. His hands were slick with sweat, his heart racing in his chest. He needed help. He couldn't do this alone. Suddenly, there was a sound. Voices, muffled and distant, but they were unmistakable. Jason's heart leapt in his chest. Other people. Could they be trapped here too? Maybe they knew a way out. He pressed himself against the wall, trying to listen. The voices were growing louder, and he could hear the distinct sound of footsteps, 2 people, maybe 3, moving cautiously through the corridors. Jason hesitated. Should he approach them? Should he trust them? He didn't know who they were or why they were here, but he had no other choice. His survival depended on it. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and cautiously moved toward the voices. As he turned a corner, he spotted them, a small group of people huddled together, clearly as frightened and uncertain as he was. 2 men and a woman, their faces pale and anxious, their eyes darting around the shadows as if expecting something to pounce at any moment. "Hey!" Jason called out, his voice strained. "Are you guys?" The group froze, their heads snapping toward him. The woman's eyes widened in surprise, and she stepped forward, her hand reaching instinctively for something at her side. The men tensed, their postures defensive. "Who are you?" the woman asked, her voice low and wary. "I'm Jason," he replied quickly, his heart pounding. I don't know what's going on, but there's something down here. A creature, I think. We need to get out, but I don't know the way." The woman glanced at the 2 men, her expression hard to read. The taller of the 2 men, a broad-shouldered figure with a scar running down his face, scowled, his voice gruff. "You're the one who opened the door, aren't you?" he growled, his tone accusatory. Jason swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I didn't know. No one warned me. I didn't mean to." "You shouldn't have come," the other man, smaller and wiry, said sharply, cutting him off. "No one is supposed to be here. Now we're all in danger." The woman held up a hand, silencing the men. "Enough," she said firmly. "We have more pressing matters to deal with." She turned back to Jason. "You saw it, didn't you? The creature?" Jason nodded, his chest tightening. "I don't know what it is. It's too fast. I barely got away." She looked at the men again, then back at Jason. "We need to stick together. The creatures are only part of the danger. There's more to this city than you realize. Much more." Jason's mind spun. Creatures? More dangers? What had he stumbled into? What do you mean?" Jason asked, his voice trembling. The woman's eyes softened, though her expression was still tense. This place, it was built to hide something the world wasn't meant to know, but that secret is waking up now, and it won't be long before it comes for all of us. Jason's head was spinning with confusion, but one thing was clear. He wasn't alone in this. He had no idea how he was going to survive, but these people, they had been here longer. They knew something. Maybe together they had a chance to find out what was really going on. The woman's gaze hardened as the rumbling sound from deep within the city grew louder. "We need to move, now." And without waiting for a response, she turned and began walking down the passage, her companions following behind her. Jason hesitated, but the sound of claws scraping against stone in the distance urged him forward. There was no time to waste. If they were to survive, they would have to stick together. The air in the underground city was thick with tension, the low rumble of the earth's movements reverberating through the narrow corridors. Jason, his heart pounding in his chest, could barely keep up with the woman and her companions as they hurried through the winding passages. The dim torchlight flickered against the walls, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move with them, as if something was watching. He had no idea where they were heading, but every instinct screamed that they were running out of time. The rumbling had intensified, and the air felt heavier, charged with a palpable energy that Jason couldn't explain. It was as though the city itself was waking up, awakening to something far more dangerous than the creatures lurking in the dark. "Faster!" the woman urged, her voice sharp. "It's too late to stop it now. We need to reach the heart of the city, to the chamber where the source lies." Jason's breath hitched. "What source? What are you talking about?" The woman glanced over her shoulder, her eyes burning with an intensity that made Jason pause. "The city's power," she said urgently. "It's not just a place, it's alive, and right now it's starting to wake up." Before Jason could ask more, a terrible screech echoed through the corridor, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against stone. His stomach twisted. The creatures, those monstrous things, were closing in. "We need to move now!" the woman shouted, picking up the pace. Her companions followed without question, but Jason hesitated. He wasn't sure how much more he could take. He'd seen horrors that would haunt him for the rest of his life, but something about this city, this place, was different. It felt as though it were waiting for them, waiting for the moment when they would reach the heart of it. Then, a figure appeared in the distance, standing in the middle of the corridor, blocking their way. Jason's heart froze in his chest as he recognized the shape, a creature. But it wasn't just any creature. It was taller, its eyes glowing an unnatural yellow, and it stood on two legs like a man. Its fur was matted and thick, and its teeth, sharp, jagged, gleaming, were bared in a snarl. The woman stopped short, her eyes narrowing. "It's one of them," she muttered under her breath. It must have been guarding the path." Jason's breath caught. "What are we supposed to do now? There's no way past it." The creature let out another ear-splitting screech, and its claws scraped the ground, moved forward, its eyes locked onto Jason as though sensing his fear, the darkness around it seeming to pulse with power. The woman stepped forward, her hand instinctively reaching for the weapon at her side. "Get back!" she shouted. "I'll take care of this!" But Jason couldn't move. His body refused to obey his frantic mind, and the creature was almost upon them. He could feel the heat of its breath, the dread rolling off it in waves. He had never felt so powerless in his life. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled with a violent force, and the creature screeched, its body jerking as though something had struck it. The air crackled, and Jason looked up, wide-eyed, as the stone walls began to crack, the ceiling shifting above them. "Move!" the woman cried, yanking Jason's arm and pulling him to safety just as the creature was thrown backward by an unseen force. The ground shook again, the city's power vibrating through everything, as though the very foundation of the earth was being torn apart. Jason stumbled, nearly falling, but managed to keep his footing. "What's happening? What's going on?" The woman's face was grim. "The city is unstable. It's responding to us. It knows we're here, and it's trying to stop us. We have to keep moving before it becomes too dangerous." But Jason could hardly process her words. He could feel the walls shifting, the earth groaning beneath his feet. And then he saw it, far down the corridor, at the very end of their path, a glowing light, a pulsing, almost hypnotic light. It beckoned them like a flame drawing in a moth. "That's it," the woman said, urgency filling her voice. "The chamber, the source." Jason felt a surge of determination. The creature was still down the hall, thrashing and snarling, but they couldn't turn back now. Not with the source so close. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward, ignoring the fear that clawed at him. Every step felt like it took him deeper into the heart of something ancient and dangerous. But as they neared the light, the rumbling grew louder, and the air grew thick with something else, something dark. The walls around them pulsed with a malevolent energy, and Jason could see shadows darting just out of the corner of his eyes. More creatures? Or something worse? The woman led the way, but the others were falling behind, their steps faltering. One of the men collapsed, clutching his chest, as if the very air was choking him. Jason stopped in his tracks, his gaze darting between the woman and the others. "We can't leave him," Jason protested, rushing back toward the fallen man. "No time," the woman shouted, her eyes flashing with urgency. "We have to keep moving, or we'll all be lost." Jason hesitated, torn between helping the man and running toward the light that promised some kind of escape. His heart pounded in his chest, but he knew what he had to do. He had come too far. He couldn't turn back now. But before he could make up his mind, the ground split open with a deafening crack. The creature, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly fury, had found them again, and this time it was not alone. Dozens of them poured from the darkness, their eyes fixed on the group. The woman shouted a warning, but it was too late. They were surrounded. Jason's mind raced. There was no way they could fight them all off, not without some kind of weapon, and certainly not when the very earth was shifting beneath their feet. Desperation clawed at his throat. "Get to the chamber!" The woman screamed, her voice raw with fear. "It's our only chance." Jason turned, the decision burning in his chest. He could feel the creatures closing in, their hot breath on his skin, but there was no turning back. He sprinted forward, pushing past the others who were still struggling to catch up. His legs felt like lead, his heart pounding in his ears, but the glowing light ahead was now within his reach. The ground was shaking so violently that it felt as though the entire city would collapse. But still, Jason ran, trusting that the light was their salvation. He reached the chamber first, bursting through the final door and collapsing to his knees. The others followed quickly, their faces pale, their bodies covered in cuts and bruises. The woman slammed the door shut behind them, breathing heavily. But it was not the end. The chamber was alive with an unsettling energy. The walls pulsed, the light grew brighter, and Jason felt a strange magnetic pull drawing him toward the center of the room. In the middle stood an ancient altar, its surface carved with intricate symbols. The air hummed with power, and Jason knew, without a doubt, that this was the source the woman had warned him about. The question was no longer whether they could escape. It was whether they could survive long enough to figure out what to do with the power that lay before them. The creatures were closing in, and the city itself was crumbling. And the only thing Jason knew for certain was that the choices they made now would determine everything. Jason knelt before the altar, his hands trembling as he reached out toward the glowing symbols etched deep into the stone. The air around him felt thick, heavy, as though the chamber itself was holding its breath. The woman and the others had backed away, their faces pale and filled with fear, but Jason couldn't look away. The light pulsed with a rhythm that matched the frantic beat of his heart. "What is it?" Jason's voice broke through the silence, hoarse and desperate. He could hear the creatures outside, scraping at the door, trying to get in, but the light seemed to offer a strange sense of protection. "What do we do now?" The woman stepped closer, her eyes filled with a mix of awe and dread. "This is the source of the city's power. It's not just energy, it's consciousness. The city is alive, and it wants us to use it." Jason felt a chill at her words. The city was alive, and they were supposed to use it? "You don't mean," Jason started, his voice faltering, "we're supposed to control it?" "No," she said quickly, her voice tinged with urgency. "We need to stop it from consuming us all. If we don't shut it down, the city will collapse in on itself and take everything with it." Jason's mind raced. How was he supposed to stop this ancient, powerful force? But something inside him, some deep, primal instinct urged him to act. He felt the light pull at him again, stronger this time, as though it was asking him to make a choice. And in that moment, he knew what he had to do. The woman's voice was frantic now. "The chamber will only accept a sacrifice. We have to give something up, something of value, or the city will never release its hold." Jason's breath caught in his throat. A sacrifice? His mind raced. What could he give? What could he possibly lose that would stop this nightmare? But before he could formulate a plan, a deep, resounding growl echoed from the door. The creatures outside were relentless, slamming against the stone with force, their rage palpable. Jason stood, determination setting in. "I'll do it. I'll make the sacrifice. It's the only way to end this." The woman's eyes widened in shock. "You can't. No one knows what will happen." But Jason didn't hesitate. He turned toward the altar and placed his hands on the cold stone surface, the energy from the symbols seeping into his skin. The light flared brightly, almost blinding, and Jason's body tensed, a shock of pain running through him. "Hold on!" he heard the woman shout, but it was too late. Jason felt the power surge through him, tearing at his very soul, and in that moment he knew he had made the right choice. As the light pulsed one final time, the room shook violently, the ground beneath them rumbling as though it were about to split open. The creatures outside howled, their cries growing louder, more desperate. But just as quickly as it began, the light vanished, and the chamber fell silent. The rumbling stopped. The tension in the air lifted. Jason staggered back, his body weak, his chest heaving with each shallow breath. The others gathered around him, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. "What happened?" One of the men whispered, his voice trembling. The woman stepped forward, her face filled with cautious hope. "You did it. The power is gone." Jason looked at her, confusion and exhaustion clouding his thoughts. "But what did I lose? I feel different." She nodded, her voice soft. "The city took what it needed, a piece of you, but you saved us all. The creatures will be gone, the city will stop collapsing, it's over." Jason couldn't quite grasp what she meant. What had he lost? And what did this all mean for him now? His body felt lighter, but at the same time, there was an emptiness inside him that he couldn't explain. He reached for the woman's arm, his voice weak. "What happens now? What do we do next?" She looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and sadness in her eyes. "Now we leave. The city is no longer a threat, but the world outside will be waiting for us, and we'll have to figure out how to live with what we've done." The group moved cautiously, walking back toward the entrance of the chamber. The air no longer felt oppressive. The walls no longer pulsed with dangerous energy. As they emerged from the dark corridors into the open, the surface world greeted them with its quiet serenity, bright, clear skies and the distant chirping of birds. But for Jason, nothing felt the same. His mind was consumed by the consequences of his choice, the knowledge that the power he had used came at a cost. He couldn't shake the emptiness that lingered within him, a piece of himself that had been lost in the process. Still, the world around him seemed unchanged. The dangers were gone, the creatures were no longer a threat, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jason took a deep breath and felt something akin to relief. The woman turned to him, her eyes soft with understanding. "You're free now. The city is gone, and we're alive." Jason nodded slowly, his eyes still distant. "But am I free? I gave up something, and I can't help but wonder if I'll ever be the same." She placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice comforting. "You saved us. You saved the world. That's more than most can ever say. You didn't lose yourself. You became something greater." Jason smiled weakly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? He had saved them all, and yet there was a part of him that was uncertain, a part of him that felt like he had left something behind that could never be reclaimed. The group made their way back to the surface, the land stretching out before them. It was quiet, peaceful. The threat was gone, and their journey was over, for now. But as Jason looked toward the horizon, a thought lingered in his mind. What now? What would he do with the rest of his life, knowing he had saved so many but lost a part of himself in the process? There were no easy answers. But one thing was certain. The adventure had shaped him, changed him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. And whatever came next, he would face it head on, knowing that the true measure of his journey wasn't in the power he wielded, but in the choices he had made. And as they walked away from the ruins of the underground city, Jason knew one thing for sure. Whatever the future held, he was no longer the same man who had first discovered the map. As the group made their way out of the crumbling underground city, the world above them seemed to embrace them with an eerie stillness, as if the land itself was waiting for them to return. Jason, still recovering from the intensity of his sacrifice, walked with slow, deliberate steps, his mind replaying the events that had unfolded beneath the surface. He could still feel the weight of what he had done, the loss he had endured, and the responsibility that clung to him like a second skin. The woman who had helped him, the one who had guided him through the labyrinth of the city, walked beside him. Her eyes were still wary, as if waiting for something to happen. As they reached the edge of the ruins to him, her voice gentle. "You did what needed to be done," she said softly, her words carrying the weight of a truth that Jason had yet to fully grasp. "The city is no longer a threat and we're all safe. It's over." Jason nodded, but the ache in his chest wouldn't go away. There was no celebration, no victorious moment to revel in. There was just a quiet sense of relief, tinged with uncertainty. What now? What would he do with the rest of his life? What did he even have left to give after what he had sacrificed? As the group ventured further into the daylight, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him. The woman's words echoed, "You became something greater." Was that really true? Or was it just an excuse to explain the emptiness he felt now that the battle was over? The group set up camp near the edge of the forest, the remnants of the destroyed city now far behind them. A sense of calm had settled over the land, but it was a calm that felt foreign, unsettling. Jason watched as the others prepared to move forward, organising their supplies and planning their next steps. He couldn't help but notice how much they had all changed. They were survivors, yes, but they had also lost something along the way. Each of them had been marked by the experience. The woman came to him, her expression unreadable as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason looked up at her, his eyes tired but searching. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice cracked. "I thought I knew what I was doing. I thought I could handle it, but now I feel like I've lost something I can't get back." She sat beside him, her gaze softening. "It's not about what you've lost. It's about what you've done. You saved us all, Jason. You stopped the city from consuming us. You faced your fear, your doubts, and you didn't run." Jason took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words settle in. It was true, wasn't it? He hadn't run. He had stayed. Even when the danger seemed impossible to overcome, when the choices seemed too much to bear, he had found the courage to face it all. And in the end, it had been enough. "You're right," he said quietly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I did, but it doesn't feel like enough." The woman's eyes softened, her voice firm but kind. "You did what no one else could have done, and maybe that's enough for now." Jason nodded, the words sinking in. He had done the impossible. He had faced his greatest challenge, and though he didn't feel whole, he had done something remarkable. He had saved them all. As night fell, the group gathered around the campfire. The crackling flames illuminated their faces, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into the distance. They sat in silence, each person lost in their own thoughts, but there was a sense of unity now that hadn't been there before. The darkness of the city was behind them, and the world ahead seemed full of possibility. Jason watched the flames dance, his mind drifting back to the moment when he had first found the map, to the journey that had led him here. He had been a different person then, unsure, searching for something to give his life meaning. Now, he could see it more clearly. The journey wasn't just about finding the city or defeating the monsters that lurked within. It was about the people he had met along the way, the lessons he had learned, and the strength he had discovered within himself. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jason allowed himself to relax. The tension that had gripped him for so long began to ease, and he found comfort in the quiet of the night. There was still a long road ahead, but for now, he was at peace. The woman beside him smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the flickering light of the fire. "What now?" she asked, as if she already knew the answer. Jason looked out into the distance, his gaze unwavering. "Now we move forward," he said, his voice steady. "We rebuild. We start again." The group nodded, their resolve strengthening as they prepared to face the future together. The lessons they had learned from the underground city, from the creatures that had stalked them, and from the sacrifice Jason had made, would stay with them. They had survived, and now they had to move forward, step by step, toward an uncertain but hopeful future. As the night wore on, Jason's thoughts shifted to the world beyond this strange, dangerous land. He had come here seeking adventure, but what he had found was something far more valuable: himself. In the face of danger, he had discovered courage. In the face of loss, he had found hope. And though the future was uncertain, Jason knew one thing for sure: whatever came next, he was ready. And with that, he stood up, his heart lighter than it had been in days. The journey was over, but the story of his life was just beginning. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the group packed their belongings and prepared to leave the remnants of the underground city behind. They had won, they had survived, and the world was theirs to reclaim.